Today I'm going to show you how to stretch paper in preparation for watercolour painting. Now this is always something that causes a little bit of confusion for beginners, and so in this video I will explain to you both how to stretch paper and why it's important. Okay, so why is it important? Watercolour paper should be stretched before painting to avoid the paper from buckling and warping. So this buckling and warping happens because as the paper becomes wet while you're painting, the paper fibres expand, and then as the paper dries they shrink. So this expanding and shrinking is happening unevenly because some areas of the surface as well as the back of the paper remain dry, while the painted areas will be drying at different speeds because they have different amounts of paint on them. So all of this uneven expanding and shrinking is pulling against areas and causing the paper to warp and bend. So this can cause you lots of problems when you're painting, as the paint will flow into all of the little dips that's caused by the buckling, and that causes problems, and as you can see here, that will cause uneven washes and these horrible cauliflower effects where you don't want them. So this is completely unstretched paper. I've just put a splodge of blue on it, and you can see it's really bent, warped, and it's created some horrible effects. Probably, well, I say horrible, you might want those effects, but probably you don't. So what we want to do is to avoid that by stretching our paper. And of course, if your paper's all buckled and bent, then it also causes problems when you want to present it or frame it. So to stretch your piece of paper, what you do is soak it all evenly so that the whole sheet of paper expands, and then you tape it onto a wooden board so that as it dries, it shrinks and it pulls against the tape, keeping it nice and taut and flat. So this reduces the amount of buckling that occurs while you're painting, and it also ensures that the paper dries perfectly flat every time, even if a little bit of buckling does happen. And it only happens if you put a lot of water on the surface. So it will always remain flat once it's dried, as long as that tape is there. So buckling occurs most often on lightweight papers. And I would always recommend that you stretch any paper that is under 300 GSM. So that's 300 grams per square metre. Or for 140 pounds, depending on what your paper is in. Quite often they have both for you, so don't worry about that. So any weight under those, I would always stretch. Personally, I do stretch my 300 gram paper as well, because I tend to use lots of washes and glazes in my work. So I do that, but quite a few other artists would probably say that's unnecessary. And it's very much up to you and the techniques that you'll be using. So another question that I get asked very regularly is if you've got a gummed pad. So that's a pad that's been glued on all four sides. So if I show you here, is all the paper's glued down on the sides. You've probably got a little gap somewhere where you can get in with a knife and separate those bits of paper out. Are they the same as working on stretched paper? Basically the answer is no. The only thing they've done is they've glued the sides together. The paper's not stretched, and so it will still buckle and warp if you put a lot of water on it. So let's have a look then at what you will need to stretch a piece of paper. So the very first thing to have a look at is your watercolour paper to start with, and I'm going to be using Arche cold press paper. It's one of my favourites, and it is a 300 gram one, but of course whatever paper you're using, then just have a go at getting off one sheet of that if it's in a pad, or cutting it to the size that you want if you've got a larger sheet that you're cutting down. So that's our number one thing to have, and it's lovely paper, beautiful texture on there. I'll just put that to the side and show you what else I've got here. So the next thing is our wooden board. So the board needs to be around about 3 centimeters bigger than the paper that you're going to stretch on it on all sides. So have a nice decent space above, below and to either side, and that way you can make sure that you've got enough room to tape it down and it's going to hold in place. The wood that you use needs to be clean, preferably unvarnished, and you can use something like MDF or ply. The thicker the wood, the better. So this is I don't know, it's about, I think, a centimetre or a bit more than that thick, but I have another piece of board that I will show you that's even thicker. So this is one of my very, very thick pieces of wood that I like to stretch on. It's an offcut from, I don't know, a table or something. I've had it for ages, I can't even remember. But this is beautiful to stretch on. The only problem is it weighs so much that if you wanted to have it any bigger than this, it would be impractical. So I would say go as thick as you possibly can, but bear in mind the weight of the wood and whether you're going to be needing to transport it at all. So the next thing that we need is the gummed tape. Now traditionally you're probably thinking of the brown stuff, but it also comes in white nowadays. Now this is gummed tape or gum strip. It's water activated tape. So that means that when it's dry, it doesn't really feel sticky. You have to put it in water to make it sticky. You cannot stretch paper with ordinary masking tape or anything like that because it won't stick wet paper. It has to be a tape that sticks when it's wet. Okay, so this water activated tape I would recommend when you're storing it, or even in between stretching your pieces of paper. Always store it far away from the water in a plastic bag. Having that bit of water there next to the whole tapes is making me very nervous, because what can happen is if you accidentally spill water over the entire tape, the whole thing is ruined. It's destroyed. Okay, so you have to keep that well away from your water. And only tear off as much as you are going to need in any session. Right, so we've got our wooden board, our gummed tape and our paper. The other things that you may need are a sponge, a small pot of water and a craft knife. I have a Stanley knife, but a small little scalpel type knife will work just as well. And that is going to be used for removing the paper from the board once you've finished your painting and for trimming up the edges. And then lastly, I would use a sink or the bath even for stretching pieces of paper. Basically, you need something where you can put the water flat to soak, and it's not going to have to be bent or anything to fit in. So for the purposes of this, I found myself a tray that is just about the right size for what I need. But generally I would use the bath, especially for larger pieces of paper, or if you're doing a lot of paper all in one go. It works very well. Okay, so I'm now going to show you how to actually stretch the paper. So the very first thing you need to do is to tear your tape to size, and then put the rest away. Keep it in that plastic bag well away from the water. So what we need to do is first of all find how large a piece we need. So I would do 4 strips of tape, 2 widths and 2 lengths, and then you've got it all torn out, it's ready to go, and you can put all of the rest away. So first of all, let me just unwind some of this, and then we can go and have a look at the paper. So you want to have a bit of wiggle room, a bit wider than the paper. So I'm going to tear it at that sort of length, and then do the same thing, and then we need 2 widths. It's very curly. Up to about there. Let me just move that over so you can see. So from width to width, and then we'll just roll that back up and put the whole of the tape away. And then what I tend to do is I lay out the 2 widths and the 2 lengths in a row like that, but away from wherever I'm doing all of the water work. So there, I literally just have to pick up one little bit at a time, and I'm not going to get water on them before I need to. So I will just put these out of the way. I'm going to actually put them on the floor behind me. And then we'll have a look at the paper. Okay, so the other thing that I do before I start is when I tear the paper off of the page, I just mark with a little F which side is the front. Because if you're doing, imagine you're doing a lot of paper all in one go, and you might be turning them over when you're soaking them, then it gets very confusing. You might forget which is the good side, which is the front side, and which is the back side. It doesn't always matter, but sometimes there will be a slightly different texture, a slightly different finish on the side at the front. So it can be more difficult to tell when the paper is wet, and you don't want to be fiddling about trying to turn it over when it is dripping wet. So I do a little F at the corner. I know which is the front, and then that causes no problem because that's going to be hidden under the tape anyway. Okay, so I now have my tray of water in front of me. It's an old school tray, if you hadn't noticed, but it's very good for this purpose. But as I said, using the sink or the bath is just as good. And I've also got by the side of me my wood board and my piece of paper. So there will be a little bit of moving backwards and forwards between the two. But as I said, we've got our paper with the front marked, and what you want to do is to wet the paper evenly. Now the best way to do this is by just submerging the whole sheet of paper, and so you know that it's all going to be soaked evenly. You will find other artists use a sponge and sort of go over it with a sponge. I don't like doing that because I find that the sponge quite often slightly damages the paper surface. So I prefer minimal amount of contact with the paper at all. So best thing to do is to soak it. You could use a spray bottle, but again, it's not going to be as even, and it might not soak all the way through the paper fibres in the middle of the paper. So this, for me, is the best way to do it. So how long you let it soak is going to depend a little bit on the type of paper that you're using, but a couple of minutes is generally okay. And you can sort of turn it over if you want to. I tend to leave it quite a while, and then I turn it over, and at the same time I think, oh, okay, is it done yet? So have a little experiment with what works for you, but try and to keep the paper as submerged as possible, but don't touch the paper too much, okay? Because sometimes your fingerprints can sort of cause issues, I have noticed. So I always try and keep my sort of fingers to the edge of the paper when it's in the water. Okay, so the paper's now been soaking for just under 5 minutes, and I'm going to just lift it out and let it drip off any excess water first of all before I move it over to the board. So I try and hold it from a corner. Again, try not to get too many sort of fingerprints over it, so keep to the edges if possible. I just let it drip away. And then what we'll do is to lay it front side up on the board and then just let it breathe. So I can still see my little F for front, but what I want to do is just let it sit there for, again, maybe a minute or two, and then let it breathe rather than putting it down and taping it straight away. Now, if you can tape it straight away, but I find that if you leave it for just a little bit, then it tends to work slightly better. If you tape it down straight away, sometimes when it shrinks, it's shrinking so much that it pulls away from the tape, and that of course can cause lots of problems. So just let it breathe for a little bit before you start taping anything. Okay, so the paper has had time to breathe now, but it's still nice and wet, of course. So what I would do is to just relay the paper so that it is nice and flat. Also, try and make it square to your board so it's not going off at a funny angle, because that can be very off-putting when you're trying to paint. So try and make sure that your right angles are lined up. You can have a little bit more space one side to the other. That's not too much of a problem as long as you've got enough to tape, but just try and keep it nice and square. And also, by relaying it, if it started to buckle already, then you're reflattening it before you tape anything down. Okay, so then we need to actually tape the sides. So as I said, I've got my bits of tape already torn from earlier, and we're just doing one at a time and sticking them down to the paper with about a centimetre overlap. So what we need to do is to dip them into water, and I just do it literally just like this, by dipping it in to the water on the one side, and then if it's a little bit too wet, you can just take off any excess with your fingers. Some people use a sponge. I don't like putting the water on with a sponge on the tape because I think it actually takes more glue off than you really need. So I will literally just go in, dip it straight in the water. That's fine. I do use a kind of dryish sponge to go back over. Sorry about the funny noise. There we go. To go back over the top of the tape and just add a bit more pressure. It's not there to wet the tape. Don't have it sort of add in water because that's probably going to be a bad thing. But it's just there. Sometimes it works a bit better than your fingers. Well, for me, I've got small fingers, so it covers a larger area. So that tends to work a little bit better. Right, so we do one side, we crisscross it over, another bit of tape. Don't let any water drip from your pieces of tape onto the paper. If you've got drips from the tape, they've got glue in them, and if they drip on your piece of paper, then again that will cause you problems when you come to paint on top of it. So try and avoid any drips going onto the actual surface of the paper. You can reposition your tape if you need to, and that is possible to do. Let me just move the camera up a little bit so you can see. Again, we've got a big bit of tape now, so I'm just dipping it in, lift it up. You can run your fingers down just once, no more than that, and I'm just going to very carefully maneuver it up to the top so I don't get any drips. And then we've got about a centimetre overlap with the paper. You can bend the tape around the edges of the board if you've got a little bit less space at one side. That's absolutely fine to do. And again, I'm just going to go over with my dryish sponge and just add more pressure to stick that down. Okay, the other thing is you can turn your board. Don't go and try and stick this side if your water's over there. Just move your board round so it's a little bit easier. Okay, and then just wet the last piece about a centimetre overlap. Again, try and be as square to the paper as possible with the tape. If you go off at a funny angle, again, it can be a little bit distracting when you come to paint, but I quite like the white paper because you can see through it more clearly. You can see where the edge of your paper is. So if you do go a little bit askew, what you can do is you can still see the edge of the paper, so you can draw yourself a border within that, and you can go from your border, not your tape. And that is quite a handy little tip to do. Right, and the other thing is, of course, you can just do yourself a border within the tape anyway, because what you're going to end up by doing is to cut the tape away at the very end after you've finished. So if you've got a border within, so that can be a drawn border just with pencil, or it could be you use a bit of masking tape or decorator's tape or frog tape to create an inner border, and then you can have your little bit of a white edge if you like that. Okay, so once it's all taped down nice and flat, you may see as it dries a little bit of buckling occurring. That's normal. Don't panic. Don't think, oh no, it's going all wrong. Literally just walk away from it, leave it, come back when it is dried, and chances are it's perfectly flat by that time. So you need to let it dry naturally. Don't try and use a hairdryer over it. Don't put it near a radiator. Let it dry naturally. I tend to leave mine overnight. And also leave them flat. Leave them flat to dry. Don't try and prop it up vertically because, of course, gravity will take effect and gravity will pull the paper down against the tape. It will come away from the tape and everything will sag and cause lots of problems. So leave it flat. Let it dry naturally, away from any heat sources, and don't panic, basically. Now, this is a reasonably small piece of paper, and so I've just used tape for this. If I was doing a large painting, I might also, as well as using the tape, use a few staples. If you're going to staple, then make sure that the staples are placed equally far apart along all of the edges. Don't sort of just add a couple here and there, because again, those will pull unevenly against the paper and cause more problems than they solve. So that is something that you can do. You can staple over the tape and it will give it a little bit more stability, and I find that helpful if you're working really big. Now the other thing to think about is that you have to leave it on the board until you have finished painting. If you take it away and then you want to add a little bit more to your painting, then it's not stretched anymore. It's been stretched, but it's not stretched anymore, so it will then buckle again. And all of that work is for nothing. So leave your painting on the board, taped down, until you are absolutely certain that the painting is finished. Once it's finished, then you can go along with your craft knife or Stanley knife or whatever and go and cut along the edges. I tend to first of all remove it from the board by cutting along where the edge of the paper to the tape is, and I then can lift that away. If you want to, you can leave the tape on the painting, but I tend to cut it away. So what I'll do is, once the painting is off the board, so here is what I've done earlier, you can see the tape is still there. So it's very sort of unevenly cut. Well, actually it's not too bad. Sometimes it's more uneven than this, but you can see that that tape is sort of jagged along the edge. I've literally just gone along and taken it from the board. So if you want to cut that tape away, remember you've tried to keep it square to the painting, but it may not be that square. So I would recommend going onto the back and then using a ruler and measuring how much in you want to cut off. Do yourself a few marks, join it up with a ruler, cut it away on a cutting mat with a metal ruler and your craft knife, and then it will be nice and neat and completely straight and square to the painting, and then the tape is nicely removed, and there we go. There will be your finished painting, nicely stretched, and that is pretty much what I wanted to show you. So as I said, this one I'm just going to leave it probably overnight now and let it dry completely naturally. Hopefully that has been helpful for you, and you now understand paper stretching, how to do it and why you need to do it a little bit better. Any questions you have, then feel free to type them in the comments below.
And if you've enjoyed the video, please remember to like, subscribe and share with your friends. Until next time, goodbye.